Well, hello, folks. I'm Jeffrey Daugherty, the Christian Whistleblower, and we're moving into hour two of my recent appearance on Coast to Coast AM. And as we started the second hour, George started talking about whether or not I believe that good would eventually win over evil. And he said something to me that really made me feel good and really made me realize that some of the work that we're trying to do is actually getting done. Some of the things we're trying to get out there are actually getting out there. George remarked that these are the strangest times that he can ever remember living in, and I shared that evaluation. And he gave me a great compliment. He said, Jeffrey, you're one of the few people that have a positive outlook on the future and on the end times, and with your expertise in biblical prophecy. Those are George's words. That it gave him great comfort, and I was very happy and very flattered and very honored to hear him say that. And then we went to callers, and the first caller was a fellow that talked about a news story that the UN had ruled that the Jewish temple, the Wailing Wall, the Temple Mount, had nothing to do with Judaism or with Israel. And of course, we discussed the ridiculous nature of that. And the temple, the Wailing Wall, which is of course made up of blocks that they picked up after they were torn apart from the temple and put it back into a wall. And the Temple Mount itself, very central to, of course, the history of Israel, but also very central to the destruction, the demolition, the repression of the original Yeshua movement. If you've listened to any of my teachings lately, and I'll try to find the right one and link it in the box below. And before I go any further, please subscribe to this YouTube channel. Do it now. I'll be here when you get back. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel now. It doesn't really make any difference for you. It's very simple. You get notifications when there's a new video. It takes you 3 seconds. For me, it's very, very important for reasons that you probably don't care about, so we won't even go into them. But the Jewish temple, the destruction of the Jewish temple in AD 70 was perpetrated, I believe, for one of the big reasons why it was perpetrated, was for the destruction of the original Yeshua message. 99% of the adherents of the original Yeshua message were living within the confines of the city of Jerusalem. Paul's message was thoroughly a provincial message out in the country, if you will. And by destroying Jerusalem and killing people almost to the man and to the woman, it was a very effective means of destroying the original Yeshua movement. And truth be told, if not for the foresight of the original disciples of Yeshua, and I think probably James and Peter, namely, if it wasn't for them getting taking some papers outside and some of their writings outside the Wailing Wall, outside of the temple, if it wasn't for that, then it would have been, we never would have heard of the original Yeshua movement, probably. And I remembered I was a little bit hot in the last broadcast, so I turned down my volume a little bit. I hope that makes a difference. But then I talked to George about a story I'd almost forgotten about. When I was in the United States Air Force, stationed in Rhein-Main Air Force Base, Germany, we had the singular privilege of going to Ethiopia, picking up Ethiopian Jewish refugees, taking them back to Israel, and listening to them talk about that they had the Ark of the Covenant. Thoroughly fascinating, and we talked about that with George, and it was very, very interesting. And then the next caller called in and asked a very interesting question. They said, is Daniel fulfilled? And as I sit back now with some perspective, I can see how this was being all worked together, because most people in big-time religion, Pauline religion, the guilt and fear control matrix, teach that Daniel is future. Oh, Daniel's future, Daniel's future. This was a lovely messianic lady that called in, and she said that her pastor taught that Daniel was fulfilled and not future. And as I told this lady, I think her pastor is absolutely right. All of the prophecies of Daniel, virtually all of them, ended with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which of course that first caller had just talked about. And only, things like this Mandela effect prophecy, which was kind of an odd one-off prophecy from Daniel. Of course, that coming to pass in our day. But I'm sorry, the prophecies of Daniel about the Antichrist and all the Daniel 9, all Daniel 12, all Daniel 7, fulfilled, folks. Not future, fulfilled. Abomination of desolation, fulfilled, not future. I also have a great video on that that's here on this YouTube channel, which if you haven't subscribed, press the button. Come on, do it. I'm not moving on until you do it. And then we had a great guest call in from Montreal, Canada, up in Quebec. And he said that he remembered a Canadian cartoonist saw the obituary of a Canadian cartoonist. His name was Aislinn, I believe, a political cartoonist, only to come to find a few years later that the man was alive. So that was a Mandela effect. And speaking of the Mandela effect, this gentleman, I believe his name was Michael from Montreal, he remembers distinctly. And this really surprised George, and we spent a few minutes talking about it, but he remembers distinctly seeing on the news, seeing in newspapers, reading in magazines about Nelson Mandela dying in prison in South Africa. Nelson Mandela dying in prison in South Africa. Now, I and probably most of you remember him ascending to the presidency of South Africa, getting out of prison, quite obviously, and dying many years later. But this man, and I wrote this down because he said, on my mother's grave, I remember and swear that I did read and see and hear of the death of Nelson Mandela in prison as a political prisoner. Fascinating stuff. Really blew George's mind. And, I've been a little dubious as to the reality of the Mandela effect aside from some very specific instances. But the more that I hear of rational, reasonable, intelligent, educated individuals relating stories that cannot be explained by anything other than the Mandela effect, I'm becoming more and more sold that it is a legitimate, real effect, and that, man, I think as I told George on last Thursday night, something's going on out there, George. And then a fellow named Steve called in, and he talked about deja vu, and that deja vu was just us reliving or remembering something that happened to us in another timeline. And as soon as Steve said that, I got goosebumps because I had just been thinking the day before, which was Wednesday, a week ago today, I'd been thinking about the fact that we are a lot of proof now that there's multiple dimensions, that there's multiple realities. And I started thinking, if there's multiple Jeffs in all of these realities, there's got to be a way to leverage the energy and the intention of these multiple Jeffs and being able to channel it into some productive activity. And I had a very interesting conversation with a young lady last night about doing this very thing. So it's something that's been rolling through my mind and bouncing around in my life. And usually when that happens, it's an indicative to me that, bam, there's something. We're just this close to a breakthrough. So you got to stay tuned. You got to stay hooked in. You got to watch the NCK Live on Sundays. You got to watch these videos. You got to subscribe. Come on, man. And it's going to be good stuff. And we're just, it's been a wild ride. I've been on Coast to Coast, I think that's 6 times now. And that almost no one is on Coast to Coast 6 times. It's been a wild and crazy ride. And I sit there and I think, man, we should be beyond where we are, but you know what? Thank all that is holy for where we are, and I think that we're right on the launching pad, ready to blast off. And if you look back there, where is that? You can't see nothing but the sun, but there's the NCK Mobile Command Center, the RV back there, and we want to put that thing into action. And then Frank called in, talked about Jack Palance, You are my number one guy. From Batman with Michael Keaton, how he had, and George had remembered him dying a couple times, people calling in and saying that he was dead when he wasn't dead. And Frank also remembered Roscoe Lee Brown, who was in The Cowboys with John Wayne and several other type of movies. And then George asked a very interesting question, and I've never seen an occurrence of this, but it's probably coming. You know, we talk about Mandela and Palance and people that we thought were dead, and then all of a sudden we see they're alive. But have we had someone who we thought was alive, but now they're dead? Or, you know, does it go both ways? They were dead before we thought they were dead. Is there people that have died that all of a sudden they're back to life? Well, some people say yes. I have yet myself to see that. And then George finished with a very personal story. And if you listen to Coast a lot, George doesn't usually tell many personal stories. He doesn't usually give you much windows into what he's thinking. And I remember when I was still doing a weekly show, I had him on my show. And it was remarkable. He opened up and he talked a lot about himself and about his family and about, you know, how he thinks and how he feels. And we had one of those moments in the show where George said, you know, Jeff, and it was like we were sitting just, you know, talking with a drink and just having just us boys together. And George talked about how he had just been to Contact in the Desert, which is out in Joshua Tree, California, out in the desert. And he talked about how he had, within one day, 7 occurrences of deja vu, premonitions. Highly unusual for him, and you could tell just from listening to him that he was very shaken by it. And we talked about the fact that there were, and I was going to look, and I've been looking, are there ley lines, are there portals? There's so much paranormal, unexplained, interesting activity in Southern California. But it was such a good show, and there was so much good discussion that George opened up and became real personal, and we got a look inside the mind and the psyche of George Noory, which was very, very interesting. And then we had Mike that called in to finish up that hour, talking about the Nephilim, aliens, and the Great Deception, which ties back to Daniel. And it was really a great segment, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And we had some good stuff yet to come. So in our next program, we'll finish up talking about my last appearance on Coast to Coast. And we'll talk about where we're going to go next. And I'm really looking forward to being on the next Tuesday from 9 to 10 a.m. I'm on the Power Hour on the Genesis Communication Network. And if you check my website, www.jeffreydaugherty.com, and my Facebook and my Twitter, you'll be able to find the link so you can listen live 9 to 10 a.m. Eastern Time next Tuesday on the Power Hour, where we're again going to talk about the Mandela effect. And I understand, I believe her name is Joyce, the lady that runs the show, big show, that she is a Pauline Christian. So this should be quite interesting. Well, until our next program, I'm Jeffrey Daugherty, the Christian Whistleblower. Will you just subscribe already? And I'm looking forward to continuing to bring you some truth so that you can grab hold of it and set yourself free, because life is so much better when you unindoctrinate yourself.